The night air in 1951 carried a salt-heavy bite, the kind of wind that rattled loose doors and hummed through the antennae of the Navy's coastal outpost. Floodlights threw rigid cones across the base, illuminating neat rows of barracks and the shadow of a lone figure, a young radio operator, making his way across the sand-dusted pavement. He was expected in the communications hut by midnight, yet within minutes he would vanish as if the darkness itself had swallowed him. The order and discipline of a military installation should have been protection, but that night it framed a disquieting truth. Even under watchtowers and protocol, someone could disappear without leaving a trace. The base was no stranger to storms. Waves beat against the seawall with a rhythm older than the Navy itself, yet the routine of duty demanded calm precision. Radios buzzed with coded chatter, clocks ticked against strict schedules, and guards marched their routes. Against this backdrop of structure, the young man's sudden absence created a rupture that no logbook could explain. His bunk remained untouched, his gear still folded, his cap hung neatly on its peg. It was as though he had stepped out into the coastal wind and dissolved. The official report would be terse, a page of clipped language buried in the Navy's records. But outside those walls, rumors fanned quickly. Had he deserted, been taken by the tide, or seen something he should not have? Each theory revealed the uneasy contrast between the institution's silence and the human need for answers. Families asked questions. Colleagues whispered. The base moved on under orders to maintain routine. Still, the absence lingered like a shadow stretching across the shoreline. For half a century, the sand itself seemed to keep the secret. Then, in the early 2000s, two coastal engineers, charting erosion patterns, struck leather with their shovels. Rising from the dune was a cracked wingtip shoe, weathered but intact, its stitching unmistakably of mid-century make. Suddenly, the silence of 1951 gave way to a new sound, the whisper of buried evidence clawing its way back into daylight. The question now was simple, yet devastating. What hidden story had this relic been waiting to tell? He was 24 years old, the son of a machinist from Philadelphia and a schoolteacher who wrote him letters in neat cursive every week. To his family, he was simply Thomas, a young man with a steady hand for soldering radios and an ambition to climb higher in the Navy's ranks. To the Navy, however, he was Seaman First Class Harland, a radio operator stationed at a windswept coastal base that faced the Atlantic with steel and antennae. The contrast was striking. At home, he was a brother who joked about his younger sister's crushes. In uniform, he was a cog in the sprawling machine of Cold War vigilance. The year was 1951. The world outside the base crackled with paranoia. America testing hydrogen bombs, the Korean War raging overseas, and the ever-present specter of Soviet infiltration. Every keystroke on a teletype, every intercepted signal, every clean radio transmission carried the weight of national security. Young operators like Harland worked long, sleepless shifts, their eyes fixed on dials, their ears tuned to static, searching for meaning in the noise. They were both invisible and essential. Invisible in the sense that no one beyond the chain of command knew their names, essential in that the machinery of defense depended on their silence and precision. The base itself was an odd contradiction. By day, it looked like any other government installation. Whitewashed barracks, an orderly mess hall, a chapel where hymns battled the sound of gulls. By night, its towers glowed red under blackout protocol, the hum of generators mixing with the roar of surf against the seawall. Procedures governed every movement, roll calls, patrol logs, secure entry checks. Yet despite this rigor, cracks existed. Guard shifts were doubled up when men grew tired, records misfiled when clerks grew lax, and secrecy often meant that failures were hidden rather than corrected. Harland's post gave him access to fragments of the world beyond, garbled distress calls from fishing boats, coded chatter from Allied ships, even the occasional intercepted pulse of signals whose origin was never explained. He wrote in his diary, a small leather-bound notebook tucked beneath his bunk, that he felt both powerful and powerless. Powerful in that he was part of something larger, powerless in that he would never know how his hours of listening altered anything beyond his console. When news of his disappearance spread, the military's reaction was swift but shallow. A search was organized, patrols scoured the coastline, and investigators asked a few perfunctory questions of fellow sailors. But in an age before DNA testing, before satellite imaging, and with secrecy as the Navy's default language, the investigation was bound by its own limitations. The official report left options open: possible desertion, possible drowning, possible misconduct. To his family it read like an insult. To his crewmates it felt like a dismissal. In town, the whispers began almost immediately. Some insisted he had been restless, disillusioned, perhaps plotting to leave his post. Others swore they saw him arguing with a superior officer days before he vanished. A few leaned into darker suspicions: kidnapping, espionage, an accident covered up for the sake of protocol. Each rumor reflected the same unsettling truth. In an institution built on control and clarity, a man had simply vanished into the coastal wind. The question that lingered, heavy and unspoken, was simple. How could someone disappear from a base designed to keep the outside world at bay? The answer, or the illusion of one, would only surface years later when the Tao de Chon. Sands shifted and a shoe rose from the earth to challenge the silence. The morning was ordinary, the kind that coastal engineers marked with clipboards and measuring rods rather than headlines. In the early 2000s, two men from the Corps of Engineers were charting the shifting dunes along a stretch of shoreline once claimed by the Navy. Their work was practical: calculate erosion rates, reinforce vulnerable banks, and ensure that the Atlantic's restless tides did not swallow the man-made defenses. But as shovels pierced sand hardened by years of salt spray, one struck leather instead of stone. The object was lodged deep, its surface cracked and brittle, as though it had waited out the decades beneath layers of shifting grains. Brushing it free, the men uncovered what at first looked like a discarded relic: a single wingtip shoe, its stitching frayed, its leather warped but intact. It was heavier than expected, weighted by sand, its form unmistakably mid-century. One man joked about vintage fashion. The other, unsettled, noticed the faint outline of a Navy stamp pressed into the inner sole. Suddenly, the ordinary survey of dunes became the accidental unearthing of a ghost. The discovery was startling not because of what it was, a shoe, but because of what it suggested. Sand was supposed to erase, to grind and scatter until nothing recognizable remained. Yet here was a remnant, fragile and human, surviving against the elements for 50 years. The contrast was sharp: nature's timeless cycles against the intimate fragility of a life cut short. If this wingtip belonged to the missing operator, then the dunes had not erased him at all. They had hidden him, guarding the evidence like a silent accomplice. The engineers turned the shoe over to authorities, who, for the first time in decades, reopened the file stamped with Harland's name. Laboratory tests were ordered. The leather, EA's fibers, analyzed under magnification, matched the production methods of Navy-issue footwear from the late 1940s. Soil samples embedded in its seams confirmed its long entombment in the dune. More chilling was the detail noted by examiners. The wear pattern inside the shoe suggested the gait of a young man, consistent with Harland's age at the time of disappearance. For the family, long resigned to silence, the news cut through years of uncertainty like salt into a wound. The shoe was not proof of death, nor did it explain how or why he vanished, but it was something tangible after decades of nothingness. It shifted the story from memory into evidence, from whispered rumor into documented fact. The case once sealed by time was now cracked open by chance, demanding attention. The engineers, men of science and structure, admitted privately that the find unsettled them. It felt like the land was speaking, one later recalled, like it had been keeping a secret, waiting for us to listen. Their unease captured the essence of the mystery. Had the dunes themselves conspired to conceal and then reveal, choosing the moment when history would finally catch up? And so, a half-century after a young radio operator vanished into a stormy night, his story surfaced again, not in classified files or whispered testimonies, but in the hollow of a shoe pulled from sand. What had been buried by time was now laid bare, and the question shifted from if something had happened to how it had all unfolded. The investigation, once stalled by secrecy, was about to ignite with new urgency. The discovery of the wingtip did more than stir curiosity. It forced a reckoning. For the first time in half a century, the name Harland was pulled from the Navy's quiet archives and spoken aloud in laboratories, history departments, and forensic offices across the country. A case once sealed by yellowing reports was now re-examined through the lens of 21st-century science. It was as if the past, long muffled by secrecy and erosion, was suddenly placed under a microscope. Investigators began was. Here the military had ended, poring over the thin stack of official documents. The first shock was how little had been preserved. A missing person report written in dry bureaucratic prose, a half-completed patrol log, a short telegram sent to his parents expressing regret without detail. But then came the overlooked details. A clerk's handwriting scrawled in the margins hinted that Harland had signed out radio equipment on the very night he vanished. The equipment was never logged back in. The contrast between the precision demanded by military procedure and the casual gaps in record-keeping could not be ignored. Historians specializing in the Cold War stepped in to provide context. In 1951, radio operators like Harland were often privy to transmissions that brushed close to classified material. Static-laden Soviet broadcasts, coded Allied chatter, and even experimental signals bounced off the ionosphere flowed across his headphones. His work may have made him a target, not necessarily of foreign agents, but of his own institution's desire for silence. In an era where secrecy outweighed transparency, inconvenient details were often buried. Yet in the present, investigators insisted on illumination. Technology became the tool that the 1950s had lacked. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed across the dune fields where the shoe was found. The scans revealed anomalies, disturbed sand patterns, possible voids, places where the earth did not settle naturally. Each hollow suggested that something had once been buried, shifted, or concealed. Forensic teams carefully extracted soil cores, searching for fabric threads, bone fragments, or metal traces. The sand, it seemed, had recorded its own testimony, though in a language that demanded painstaking interpretation. Meanwhile, DNA testing offered the potential for certainty. Trace fibers clinging to the interior of the shoe was re-examined, though the degradation of decades made analysis fragile. Still, scientists managed to extract a partial profile. It was not conclusive, but it was enough to compare against the living. Harland's younger sister, now in her 80s, agreed to provide a sample. The results suggested a familial link, not absolute but compelling. The shoe was his, or at least had almost certainly been worn by him in the final hours before his disappearance. The investigation widened beyond science. Retired sailors and townspeople were interviewed, their memories fragile, yet sharp with certain details. One elderly witness, a former guard, recalled seeing Harland walking toward the seawall near midnight, his silhouette lit faintly by the tower lamps. Another insisted she had glimpsed him climbing into a Navy jeep with 2 other men, though her recollection was clouded by the distance of years. The contradictions raised troubling questions. Had he walked to the shore, or had he been escorted, voluntarily or not, into a vehicle? Each story carried weight, but none aligned neatly with the others. Maps of the coastline from the 1950s were compared to modern charts. The contrast was astonishing. Entire stretches of dune had migrated inland, swallowed by storms, or reshaped by currents. The place where the shoe was discovered had once been closer to the base's perimeter road. This suggested that if more evidence had existed, remains, equipment, or even a vehicle, it could have been buried and then reburied by decades of shifting sands. Nature itself had become both an accomplice and an archivist, concealing the truth while keeping fragments intact. Archival researchers dug deeper into Navy records long thought irrelevant. In a forgotten box of personnel files, they found a memo marked confidential. It referenced disciplinary concerns involving Harland, hinting that he had reported irregularities in communication logs. No details were given, but the implication was that he had noticed something unusual, perhaps transmissions that should not have been there. The file was thin, and most of its attachments had vanished, but its very existence introduced a new possibility. Harland may have stumbled onto something dangerous enough to make him a liability. The investigation spiraled into layers of contradiction. On one hand, the evidence suggested an accident, a man walking near the dunes, overtaken by weather or a misstep into soft sand. On the other, the fragments pointed toward erasure, missing files, inconsistent witness accounts, a shoe buried deep where no natural accident would have placed it intact. The contrast between these explanations was stark: simple tragedy versus deliberate silencing. Which carried the weight of truth? Families of other missing servicemen from the era began to come forward, each with their own unresolved mysteries. Their stories created a chorus of silence, reinforcing the possibility that Harland's case was not isolated but part of a broader pattern. The Navy, when pressed for comment, issued statements heavy with formality but light on substance. "Records from that period are incomplete," one spokesperson said, "and conclusions cannot be drawn." Yet the more they deflected, the sharper the public interest grew. The deeper investigators probed, the more it seemed that Harland's disappearance was less about what could be proven and more about what had been carefully left unprovable. A misplaced file here, a silence in testimony there, an absence of evidence that itself felt orchestrated. If this had been a simple accident, why did every step toward clarity reveal only thicker fog? As forensic teams prepared to widen their search across the coastline, one question became unavoidable. Had Harland simply been a victim of nature and time, or had someone, somewhere, ensured that his story was swallowed before it could ever be told? The answer, fragile and contested, lay waiting in the next revelation, one that would pierce through all silence and expose a truth far darker than dunes could ever bury. The disparate threads of testimony, records, and buried artifacts converge toward a chilling implication. The operator may not have vanished by chance. Instead, he might have overheard or intercepted something never meant for his ears, a classified transmission, or perhaps evidence of illicit activity along the Cold War coast. The tension sharpens in contrast. Official Navy reports remain sterile and procedural, clinical in their dismissal of unexplained absence. Yet, lived accounts, from weathered locals and retired sailors, speak of fear, whispered rumors of nighttime landings, shadowy figures unloading crates, and the quiet knowledge that questions were not welcome. The cracked wingtip shoe, once dismissed as mere coincidence, takes on grim significance when paired with newly surfaced fragments. A torn scrap of a duty roster, an erased entry in a ship's log, and radar anomalies buried in the dunes. Together, they suggest not wandering, but a violent interruption, a man silenced rather than lost. As the investigation pushes deeper, the confrontation is no longer just with the past, but with an institution reluctant to acknowledge ghosts in its own walls. Researchers and families find themselves standing at the uneasy crossroads of institutional silence versus human truth. The question grows heavier with every discovery. What else lies buried, beneath the shifting sands and within the locked vaults of forgotten archives? Decades had passed, but the truth finally emerged from layers of secrecy and time. Declassified Navy files, once buried under bureaucratic protocols, revealed gaps, inconsistencies, and subtle evidence of negligence, perhaps even deliberate obfuscation. Analysts cross-reference these documents with forensic findings from the wingtip shoe, soil samples, and archival maps, creating a mosaic that told a story long denied. The contrast between past denials and present acknowledgement underscored the weight of delayed truth as decades of silence gave way to clarity. Public statements and internal Navy reports now recognized Harland's disappearance as a failure of oversight. While there could be no rescue, the acknowledgement itself carried symbolic justice, a formal recognition that his life and service mattered, even 50 years later. The procedural sterility of the original investigations was replaced with humanized accounts, detailing the gaps, the unanswered questions, and the tireless efforts of investigators determined to reclaim his story. Family members, many now elderly, received closure of a kind long deferred. Letters of apology, documentation, and interviews allowed them to piece together the circumstances that had haunted generations. For descendants, Harland was no longer a footnote in a dusty ledger. His name was restored to the narrative of the Navy, of the base, and of history itself. They could finally see the human side behind the vanished man, the individual who had once been just another operator in the machinery of global defense. For the public and historians, the case illustrated the duality of institutions and individuals, how meticulous procedures could fail, and how ordinary people could endure decades of uncertainty. It also highlighted the courage of those who pursued truth despite silence and time. The wingtip shoe, once a solitary clue, had become a symbol of perseverance, a tangible reminder that even small remnants can carry enormous significance. Yet the shadow of doubt lingered. Even with justice and acknowledgement, questions remained. Had Harland's disappearance been a tragic accident of nature and circumstance, or a deliberate effort to silence a man who had witnessed too much? This uncertainty ensured that the story would continue to spark reflection on the limits of accountability, the consequences of secrecy, and the delicate balance between institutional duty and human life. With the SODs, Ace officially reopened and documented, the narrative shifted from speculation to resolution, yet the dunes themselves, silent witnesses for half a century, remained a reminder that history often keeps its own counsel until chance, persistence, and evidence converge to reveal it. The next chapter would not be rescue, but remembrance, honoring both the life lost and the long quest for truth that finally illuminated it. The dunes that had once swallowed secrets now stood as silent witnesses to a story half a century old. Sand, shifting with each tide and storm, had concealed a life and yet preserved its trace, reminding all who looked closely that time both buries and reveals. The contrast between the fears of 1951, of spies, of the unknown, of a world teetering on the edge of war, and the present culture of remembrance highlights how history eventually bends toward exposure, no matter how deep it is buried. Coastal engineers, whose daily work was intended to protect shorelines from erosion, had unwittingly become archivists of justice, uncovering evidence that brought closure to a family and clarity to history. Their discovery illustrates how ordinary labor can intersect with extraordinary truth, and how chance and persistence can illuminate mysteries long thought lost. The story of the missing Navy radio operator has since been retold in archives, documentaries, and local history, reclaiming a life once erased from public memory. It serves as a reminder that human curiosity, combined with scientific tools and patient inquiry, can challenge silence and bureaucratic oversight. For viewers and historians alike, the case leaves a lingering question. How many other stories, lives, and truths lie buried beneath shifting sands, waiting for someone to notice, to dig, and to listen? The dunes, patient and indifferent, hold their secrets, but occasionally they yield them to those willing to seek the light.